Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome. Now, we've got a very interesting show this week because Tim Hull, who was my guest 2 weeks ago, has kindly agreed to come back. I think he's only humoring me because one of the things I boast about is that every one of my guests has said they've enjoyed it and were willing to come back. So he's proving me true there. Thanks, Tim. And the other guest is Sam Priest. Now, Sam is somebody that I bumped into on, I think, the Unbelievable Facebook group since 2 weeks ago when Tim was my guest. So Sam and I haven't had a lot of time together, but he's in Australia, which means that in order to span the time zones, Tim has bravely got up very early in his part of the world. I think he's on Eastern Standard. And it's evening where Sam is located at the moment. So he's probably about to quaff some of that lovely Australian red wine. Whereas here in the UK, it's lunchtime. So the sun hasn't gone over the yard arm here yet. So I'm on the water. Anyway, it's enough of me rambling. I don't know how this show is going to turn out because, as usual, we don't have a tight format. I start a conversation. We don't know where it's going to go. Should be exciting. Welcome, guys.
Hi, John. It's good to be with you.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
Well, thanks for coming, you guys. You are heroes to join in from your respective parts of the world at your respective times of day. So the usual...
Hero is a strong word, but I'll take it.
The usual procedure in these shows is to give my guests an opportunity to say a little bit about themselves. So can we start with, I'm going to go alphabetical surnames order. Okay. So Sam, can you tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, I'll be short because I gave a longer intro the last time I was here. My name is Tim. I run a YouTube channel called Dealing with Deconstruction. I'm a pastor at a church called Emma's Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I enjoy having these types of conversations with people that disagree with me. And Sam, I've met you several times on the Unbelievable page as well. I have lots of respect for you, and sometimes I'll tag you in when I'm talking to somebody on the other side because you and I share a lot of things in common, particularly when it comes to some of the methodological or philosophical realm. So I'm enjoying the possibility of having this conversation, and I'm glad I'm here.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, as Tim's just said, you know, we've interacted kind of here and there on the Unbelievable Facebook page before. I myself, of course, am not a pastor of any kind. I'm just a lowly science teacher. I sort of peruse around various Facebook discussion groups here and there. Initially, my interest came from, I wouldn't say it was about religious discussions at all. I originally started out joining science pages on Facebook. However, I quickly found that if you interact with science Facebook pages, particularly a few years ago, I would find religious people lurking there. And it would lead me to various discussions about things like, you know, evolution, age of the universe, things that I'm interested in, but not necessarily from a religious perspective. However, though, from some of those discussions, some of which have been good, some of which have been frustrating, it kind of brought out in me this interest in forming good arguments for conclusions that I think I can say with confidence, and being able to articulate those arguments as well as possible. So, for example, through the Unbelievable page, for example, it's given me an excuse to do things like research my position a little bit better, read some of those scientific papers, perhaps learn how to present them to people who are unfamiliar with the research in a more approachable way. I've learned how to do things like, you know, interact with symbolic logic, which I would never have in my wildest dreams have touched otherwise. So I think these discussions can be really good. I think everyone can kind of learn something from them. Whether you change your mind or not, I think it can broaden your horizons a bit, and even just get you to understand the opposing position a little bit better, if it even is an opposition. So I'm hoping this is a good discussion today.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming on, you guys. And what I think, like you, Sam, is that we've got to try and find the nub of the disagreement so that we can unravel it, analyze it, and try to solve it. And
yeah, absolutely. I think because I did have a look at your discussion that you had with Tim a while ago, and I think there's several points that I found in that discussion where there were some things I thought you said were really interesting. There were some things I thought Tim said which were really interesting, and I found myself my opinion was almost sort of halfway between the two of you on quite a lot of points there. So I think it is about finding the nub of that disagreement, which I think, John, you probably put down to a difference of, are we going with evidence or are we going with raw argument? I probably would have characterized it as more just perhaps a difference in perspective on what the role of evidence actually is in scientific arguments, and kind of, I don't know whether it's about how crucial it is or just sort of how strongly we can rely on arguments, what kind of conclusions can we draw, things like that. It's interesting. So there was a discussion about the role of deduction. There was a discussion about evidence, different kinds of evidence, all these kind of interesting points.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank our audience, as we do have a small audience watching us at the moment. And I'd like to draw your attention, audience, to the ticker going along the bottom. Feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the comment bar. But if you want to direct a question to either of us, could you just put a Q in front of it so that I know that it's something you want me to put on screen? So thank you for that. So where are we going to start then? Because we could take a look at some clips from the conversation Tim and I had 2 weeks ago. Would that be a starting point? Or,
I mean, that's one option. My initial thought, based on having a look at the discussion, I think if I'm right, I don't want to speak for Tim, but I got the impression a couple of times that perhaps he thought that you might be misreading his position a little bit on just what maybe your difference exactly might have been. So I would have actually liked to just ask Tim to start us off and say what he perhaps thinks might be the difference between his perspective on arguments, or perhaps what he thinks the role of evidence in science might or might not be. What sort of difference does he think might be between the two of you there?
You're right, because I characterized our discussion as whose boss is it, thought or observations? Is it, what's going on in your head or what's out there in the natural realm? And Tim said that wasn't a good characterization. What do you say, Tim?
No, I don't think that's a good characterization. I think the nature of our disagreement, John, after lots of conversations, and particularly the conversation that we had a few weeks ago on your channel, comes down to our epistemological methodology. And mainly what I'm trying to do is to try to crack that shell of epistemology and open it up a bit more, because I think there are things that we can know that are not subject to the scientific method. And if we can look at that and say, okay, if we can know something about the real world apart from the scientific method, right, then what else can we know about the real world? What does that method then lead us to? And so I think that's kind of the main disagreement that I feel like we have. And I think this is illustrated in the fact that you would put God in the category of, well, I can take a picture of the palm tree in my front yard and send it to you. Why can't I do the same thing to God? I think that's a massive category error. And you expecting something along those lines for the existence of God, I think is a mistake. And so for me, you're saying, well, just present the evidence for God. And I'm saying we can't even get there, because anything that I would present, you would just say, well, it's not like the tree in my front yard. And then so we'd be stuck. And so that's where I think the nub of the disagreement is. What I'm trying to do here is not necessarily present evidences for God. I'm trying to open up the conversation and say, how can we know apart from the scientific method, or can we know apart from the scientific method? And what would that look like? And then what other things then become available to us in light of that?
So following you there, give me an example of something that we can know that does not stand up to a scientific investigation?
Well, I think, I think it's not completely separate, but things like the nature of existence, things like the nature of cause and effect, things like moral truths, the difference between is and ought. So I think there's several categories of things. I think we can know internal truths. I think the grounding of our epistemology are all things that we can know apart from the scientific method. So I forwarded a video. Sam, I'm not sure how much, I mean, I'm sure you know about this, but there's a conversation between coherentism and foundationalism, and I can't remember what the third category is. But I think what our foundation is for knowledge, we can know things. I can know that I exist apart from the scientific method. So I don't need that. I can know that I have a headache apart from the scientific method. So again, those are examples. I can know things that if all knowledge is dependent on some other thing, you have to say, what's that grounding thing? Because you can't build your knowledge off something that doesn't actually exist or you don't know.
Yeah,
well,
so this...
Okay, Tim, you go ahead.
Sam may go ahead. You mean? Yeah, so this kind of, it drills down to what I thought was probably your disagreement there is, and I think you're right, Tim, is I tend to agree with your characterization of the difference that's happened between the two of you there. Is essentially that there's this discussion of, look, there's limits to what conclusions we can actually draw with the information we've got, and we're sort of exploring what are those limits. And you're perhaps saying that, you know, there are certain things we can know, you know, for lack of a less colorful way to describe it, by just kind of lying back in our chairs and thinking about it, we can kind of know certain things. And like, for example, I would agree that, you know, I think therefore I am is a good way to conclude that I am. You know, if I wasn't, I wouldn't be able to think that I am. That makes good sense to me. And there was a comment that John made in the discussion that you two were having a while ago that was to do with how much you can actually pull out of deductive logic. So he kind of said, well, it almost got to this discussion where he was saying, well, it's almost a bit circular in the sense that you can't get out of deductive logic more than you put into it. And I think I might agree with him in sort of perhaps different words to that. I wouldn't call it circular, but to me, it kind of harkens back to some of those truths that we know from dealing with maths, with logic and mathematics go kind of similar to each other. In maths, if you're a maths person, you'll know that if you've got three unknowns, you need three equations to solve them, for example. You can't get more out of it than you've actually put in. You can't solve something about X unless X has gone into one of your equations that you're putting together. And I think in the same way, if you're running deductive logic on, you know, things like defined terms, and, you know, things that those definitions encompass, and all you're starting with is defined terms and kind of logical relations, all you're going to get out of an argument is things pertaining to those defined terms. Like I might define what a dog is, I might define what hair is, and I might find that by my definition of a dog, it has hair. I'm going to get that out of an argument because I've somehow put it into the premises that I was working with to begin with. Now, I think when we're starting to deal with perhaps supernatural topics or things like God, things like that, I think a lot of theistic arguments begin with, you know, reasonable premises about what they're talking about. So they'll begin with, you know, we'll define what God is. We'll, you know, state a few definitions of other terms we're going to use. And they kind of put that together, turn the mathematical logical crank, and then spit out something about God, usually that it exists, right? But the problem with that is you can turn a crank and show that by your definition of God, if there's a God, it's an existing one. I'll agree with that most of the time, right? Because it's probably baked into the definition somehow. But the thing is, unless you've used some sort of premise about the real world, you can't turn that logical deductive crank and get something about the real world itself. It's got to be in there within the premises, because otherwise all you're going to get is you're going to get So to sidetrack for a second, if you know anything about deductive logic, any logical sort of if-then statement, you can put it as a Venn diagram, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the conclusions you draw out of logic, so you've drawn all your Venn diagrams, you've described how they overlap, and you found their intersections, and the conclusion you pull out of your logical argument is something that you can see on that Venn diagram that you've drawn. Now, if you haven't drawn anything to do with the real world in that Venn diagram, then you're not going to be able to conclude anything about it. All you're going to be able to do is conclude something about the defined terms you've got. You can come up with like a mathematical theorem, but you don't know that anything that actually applies to it. I think there's a limit there. I think to get something about the real world, you've got to begin with a premise talking about the real world. And I think perhaps if it might appeal to you, a good reason for that might be if you're working with deductive logic and you're beginning with nothing but necessary truths, all you're going to conclude are other necessary truths, things like mathematical theorems, things like rules of inference. However, the real world, as we know, isn't all necessarily true. There's contingent things in the real world. And I think we might agree that there's contingent things out there.
John, do you agree with that?
Contingent if all we have is necessary stuff.
John, do you agree that there's contingent things out there?
In my view, everything is contingent. I know of no necessary things. But I wanted to say something about existence because, yes, you know you exist, both of you. You know that, I am, therefore I am. Sounds like Popeye, doesn't it? So, but there's two levels of that, isn't there? There's personal information, which can't be shared. I mean, if you've got a headache, you're the only person who knows that. I can't drill into your head and check it by observation or anything like that. Then there's general observation. These are truths that are possessed by a sector of the population, and those have to be observable. So although I can observe you, Tim, and I can say he exists, there's evidence that he exists. He's occupying space. He obviously has some mass, and I can see that he's breathing, so he's interchanging air. There's evidence for your existence that I can observe. I can't observe your headache. So these are two different things. But I've got a couple of questions coming in here.
Well, but I think that's a really important distinction. I was reading. Would you say, Sam, that I could say that I have knowledge that I have a headache, even though John can't test it scientifically?
I would say that you can have knowledge that you have a headache, but John can't.
Right. Okay. So
put it that way.
So right. So from again, correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to straw man your position, John. But you're saying that knowledge is of things that are external from the person. You can only have knowledge of things that are testable, repeatable, observable through the scientific method. Only those things can be counted as knowledge.
No, I'm not saying exactly that.
Okay.
I'm saying
correct me.
I'm saying we can all have personal knowledge about our condition at the moment, whether we got constipation or whatever it is. But that's not very useful, except to us. What is useful is general knowledge, which can be shared and the population can all learn from it.
Okay, so now, but you've added this qualifier on there of usefulness, but then usefulness would be a subjective judgment. So whether or not you deem something useful would be something that, either it's either me or the three of us get together and say, hey, it's really useful to have this conversation. So we decide to do it. But if nobody watches it and no one jumps on, how useful is it? Like, how do you determine that which is useful?
So,
okay, you go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, if I may, I think, so John and I are both, either current or past science teachers. I think that idea of an idea being useful is a very science teacher thing to say. I often tell my students that science discovers what's useful, not what's true necessarily. So my main subject is chemistry. I can teach biology and maths and things like that as well, but chemistry is my main one. And there are so many things in my subject that I know for a fact are actually not the way things work, but by God, they're useful. And they're good teaching tools, and they kind of get you there at the end of the day. So I think And in terms of, if you're a research scientist, I think what ends up happening is that if you've got an idea that picks up traction because everyone's citing your paper because they're finding other things that they can build on from your research, I think it's sort of a real world measure of how useful your idea has been to other people. So I think there is a real sense of how useful something is. But of course, I mean, there is a subjective element.
Right, but so I have two definitions here up on my screen, and one is scientific realism. And scientific realism, as I'll give the definition here, is a scientific theory that accurately describes the world. And then there's scientific instrumentalist. Scientific theories are useful for predictions and classifying, but do not relate to an objective truth. Now, which would you guys say that you are based on those two definitions? Are you a scientific realism camp, or are you in the scientific instrumentalist camp?
Well, if you see a snake and it's one you've not seen before, would it be useful to know whether it's one that could kill you with a poisonous bite or whether it's one that you could skin and cook and eat? Would that, at that basic level?
Right. But I want to get us beyond the snakes. So I've posed a question. Would you say that you're a scientific realist or a scientific instrumentalist based on the definitions that I just gave? I think that's the core of what we're trying to do. If you're saying that science can get us things that are really useful, but it can't get us to objective truth, well, then that's fine. But then we have to ask the question, what can actually get us to objective truth? Oh, we just lost Sam.
Yeah. Well, I'll go with, I don't think objectivism is possible. I think that maybe when we've got AI working, and we can completely let machineries do the thinking for us, then perhaps they will come up with some objective truths. But at the moment, pretty much everything that we get involved in has got to go through a brain and is therefore going to get tainted by whatever bias that brain has. Sam's back.
Sorry, guys, I have no idea what happened there. I'm going to blame Australian internet for that one. So I'm sorry. I'm sure I missed some great comments. But I didn't.
I was just asking if you would put Sam. Would you put yourself in the scientific realism camp or the scientific instrumentalism camp based on those two definitions?
So I would say that science is probably primarily instrumental because, as I said, we defer to this idea of we're willing to use something even if we know that it's technically not true, but it is useful to us. However, I would say with sufficient investigation, I do think that science can tell for us, it can give us a very good picture of how the real world really does actually work. And of course, that investigation is sometimes the purpose of a scientific experiment, is to work out how the real world works. So certainly what we've found in science and the models that we generate in science, we generate a model of the universe. I think we do have good reason to trust that that model is a good analog for the real universe, if that makes sense.
Okay, so then my follow-up question would be, what method can we use to get to actual objective truth about reality? Because that's what I'm concerned about. And if your methodology and you guys are both comfortable with instrumentalism in a sense, right? Again, I realize the caveat that you just gave there, Sam. But my question is then, how do we get to objective truth? What are things that we can know objectively true? Are those only necessary truths? Are those only, analytic truths in that sense? Where I think there's a difference between analytic truths and necessary truths. So I think, again, necessary truths, I'll just read a quote here from 10 Philosophical Mistakes. Examples of knowledge in this extreme sense of the term are a small number of self-evident truths. A self-evident truth is one that states something the opposite of which is impossible to think. It can also be called a necessary truth because it is the opposite of impossible. So that's how I would define necessary truth. Now that's different than something like an analytic truth, which may be something like, how many sides does a triangle have? That would be analytical because it's in the definition, or a married bachelor or something, or an unmarried bachelor, because those are definitional, or square circle, stuff like that. So I think that's at the core of kind of where a disagreement is. So I'm asking the question, how do we get to objective truth? And if you're saying, well, the scientific methodologies can get us good approximations, but it's really not seeking objective truth. It's more just useful in that sense. So it's an instrumentalist perspective. Okay, that's fine. But now we're not discussing the same thing. We need something wholly different to be able to move forward in the discussion.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point to raise, because I will say, look, a lot of people who are out there kind of discussing things will talk about science as if we're discovering how the world works, and in a sense, that's what we're kind of trying to do. But again, I'll draw the kind of mathematics analogy again. So if I'm an engineer and I'm solving some kind of mathematical problem, the way I do that is I phrase my problem in a mathematical way. So the analogy here would be I'm phrasing my problem in a logical way, right? I'm constructing a logical framework, and that's my model of the problem I'm dealing with. And what I then do is I apply logic to my model, and I cross my heart and hope that I got my model right, and therefore, because my model is congruent with reality, therefore my solution will be congruent with reality's solution. Now, to get to your question, how do we access the real truth? I don't necessarily know that we actually can. But if I was to take the position that what I'm doing with my logical construct actually there's no kind of direct map there. If I don't think my logical conclusions actually map to real conclusions, it's kind of a little bit like solipsism, because I have to kind of believe that this framework that I'm working with, I'm kind of living in some sort of parallel universe where it's sort of working for me within the little framework that I've concocted for myself. And I run my life based on my little logical models of how I think things work. But somewhere down the line, I could hit some wall where actually all my assumptions have been wrong one day. Technically, I do have that problem. But if I run my life being fearful of that all the time, I'm not going to have a very happy life. And I think what we do as scientists is we go with what works best, because we have an understanding of that fact that we can never have that real objective knowledge. It's not going to come. Because as you rightly point out, how can we possibly access that? Now, presumably, Tim, you believe you have a way to access that. I, of course, disagree, because as I said, I think if you only start with definitional statements, you can only yield things about those definitions. Again, not about the real world. You're kind of thinking that there's something in the world that maps to those definitions, but you still are drawing a map, and you're following the map to navigate your way through that territory. I don't think anything that we're doing, as John would agree, anything we're doing in our heads with logic is the territory. It's always the map. We are restricted to working with the map and drawing our ideas on the map. And we think that map matches the territory. We might be wrong. We've used our best tools available to us to try and map it correctly, but we could always trip on a rock.
Yeah. So in a sense, we do live in a parallel world. We live in our heads with our models, and all we can do is pragmatically check them with the other world, which is the natural realm. And this is why there are such things as logical paradoxes, and you know, logic is a thought process. It's the best we've got, but there's no law that says it's the same as the natural realm. It's just modeling, and models can get better, just like maps can get better, and they have done over the centuries. But I've got some people here who want their questions addressed, so I'm going to put some up for us to take a look at. Otherwise, our small but delightful audience might get fed up.
Fair enough.
Yeah, so this is a question that we addressed last time on the show, so I'll just quickly address it again. I think the process or methodology that you use must be comported to or ported to parallel with the type of claim that you're addressing. And there's several different types of claims, and so there'll be several different methodologies. But typically, I mean, I would take a very loose form of like a Bayesian, and again, Sam can explain that better than I can, but that there's probabilities on a lot of different, options that we have out there, explanations for things. But I think in general, there's not a one method fits all type thing. And that's one of the things that I've been trying to communicate, is that to say this is the method that you must use, I think falls short of the variety of types of things that are in our reality. So that's how I would answer that question. So it's not a one size. So I can't just give you, here's the single method that you must use in order to be able to find out reality. I think it depends on the type of claim that you're looking at, what type of method that you're going to use.
So can I ask as a follow-up to that, Tim? I mean, presumably, so you're drawing this distinction between sort of the scientific method of working things out versus, just generally using whatever methods available to work things out. My contention would be the scientific method is the way it is precisely because of the restrictions we have on working out how things work. So, for example, this science is, this idea of falsifiability is very central to scientific method. You can't propose something unless it's in principle falsifiable, because if it's not falsifiable, it's not testable. I would contend that the reason for that is actually to do with the way logical inference has to work. So if you've got at least some knowledge of kind of, logical deduction, things like that. If you know anything about the operation of modus tollens,
Mm-hmm.
If A then B, not B, therefore not A, that's an argument form that is pivotal and central to scientific experiment. Because what science does is it goes, okay, here's my hypothesis. I'll make a prediction based on that hypothesis, and then I run an experiment, and if that prediction's false, I'm forced to falsify my hypothesis, right? And in the exact same way, you play this logical trick. If you're trying to affirm something, you go, okay, I'm not going to consider my hypothesis. I'm going to consider the null hypothesis, which is falsity of my hypothesis. I'm going to make a prediction off of that. So not hypothesis implies prediction. Falsify that prediction, I can falsify the null and therefore affirm my hypothesis. That's
Right.
how scientific testing works. So this either way, you have to falsify something if you want to gain knowledge. And that's why you end up with this idea of falsifiability in science, and that's why it's baked into the method. And it's also the reason why science has locked itself into methodological naturalism, because natural things are testable things. The only coherent distinction that I can ever really come up with between natural and supernatural is that supernatural things don't seem to follow any causation framework or pattern, and they're not testable for that reason. So if they're not like that idea that something has to be, a thing that interacts causally and is therefore testable, it's not that science has come into the arena and gone, I'm going to assume this without warrant and just go with it, and that's my system. Science has been forced into that corner. Science has come into the room and gone, look, we can't investigate anything properly and work things out unless I'm proposing testable things, or things where I can make a prediction off of them and then refute said prediction. Okay, if we can't do that, we can't test it logically. It's not an arbitrary thing. So, I mean, based on those comments, are you suggesting that there's things kind of outside of that there's things that we can kind of affirm the existence of logically without that operation of modus tollens? Like, is there some other kind of way that you can do it? Why do you think science actually does this?
Well, let me say just a second on falsifiability, because you mentioned falsifiability. So let me propose this to you. So in one of the videos from Carneades.org, are you familiar with Carneades.org?
Unfortunately not, sorry, but
okay. So he's a skeptic philosopher, leans atheist or at least agnostic, depending on how you want to define it. But he is not a Christian. So this is not an argument that I'm making from a Christian perspective. But he lays out this argument in one of his videos. I have it up on my screen. I'll do my best to read it. A theory is falsifiable if and only if it is tested false Its tested falsehood is not dependent on the truth of other theories. Premise 2, if a theory cannot be tested in isolation, then its tested falsehood is dependent on the truth of other theories. Premise 3, no theory can be tested in isolation. Premise 4, all theories, their tested falsehood is dependent on the truth of other theories. Conclusion, therefore, no theory is falsifiable. So even in bringing in something like falsifiability, which I think in principle, again, is fine. It's a fine kind of thing to hold to. But if we apply something like that argument, no theory is falsifiable because it is dependent on other theories that we're bringing in. So it's dependent on other data points.
For a second. Do you actually believe that? Do you really think that there are no falsifiable statements?
Well, it doesn't say it says scientific theories. So we're only talking about the scientific theory.
What's the practical difference between those two things? I mean, I can state something and go, that's my theory.
Well,
right?
but like it's the start. That's where I'm trying to find the starting point. We're trying to find the foundationalism would be the starting point that I have, that we have a solid foundation for the then scientific theories that we're continuing to work on. If you're saying that my beginning scientific theory that I'm working on, the knowledge that I have to build on is completely uncertain when it comes to objective truth, how are you then taking another step? So for me, that's
the thing. I'm not taking that step. Is any truth statement I make is a truth statement about my model of the universe. Okay, I'm actually never stepping outside of that model because we can't, for exactly the same reason that I can't affirm to you that I am not a brain in a vat right now on an alien spaceship. I actually can't take that step because it's not accessible to me. Now, you might argue that that is a problem because maybe the aliens are going to, zap my brain and destroy it in 5 minutes' time. I actually don't know that. Like, we don't have access to that.
Well, so I think that's a really interesting point. I think that's a really interesting point. Again, I think this is we're just using colloquial terms, but when we're talking philosophically, as you know, we have to get very specific. So I think you can know that, and by me saying that you can know that, I'm not saying that you can have certainty that you're not a brain in a vat, but I'm saying that you can have justification for the proposition I am not a brain in a vat. That solipsism.
What that is, and if you have justification for that, don't I have exactly the same justification for scientific truths that we've determined through this model?
You do. That's exactly what I'm saying. So here
you have no problem. Excellent.
Right. Okay.
We're all in agreement. What I said is right. That's it.
Yes. But the difference is that I want to know why that is the case. What is the metaphysical grounding for that being the case? So if you say,
I don't agree. You agreed it's the case. I'm working in my model. You think it maps to something else.
Well, I know, but our shared data point, Sam, is that it works, that we can do this, right? The question that I have is, why does it work?
Why does it work? Because
it enables the construction of models. That's why.
They're accurate models, yeah. The idea is that if we've formulated that model accurately, logic will follow through with that model. Logic must also apply to the real world, which is a new thing that we might want to discuss in a bit. But if the logic follows within the model, the same logic will follow within the real world, and they should map. So if you get the starting premise of an argument right, as you were saying last time you discussed with John, if your premises are true, and your deduction is valid, then your argument's conclusion is also necessarily true.
Now, John, would you agree with that?
No.
Okay, so why don't you guys talk about that for a second?
I'll side with Tim on this one.
Okay.
I think by definition, if you've got a sound argument, that the problem with science, though, is that you never have that 100% certainty that your premises are ever true. That's the problem. So we might stumble onto a sound argument, but we're never going to be certain that we get it. So we have things like sources of experimental error and false assumptions and things. If I teach my students in my classes when we're writing scientific reports, the first thing you do, you write your introduction section, you give the background information, you talk about all of the uncertainties that you have in that, right? They're your premises of your argument. You gather some new premises in an experiment. That's your link to the real world. That's the empirical step. And then you discuss your inferences from your results in your discussion. You talk about errors. Your sources of errors are always there. You're never sure that you have a sound argument unless you're starting out with some really boring, necessarily true premises that will get you nowhere beyond that same diagram that you drew out with their definitions. Unless you stay in that realm of definitions, like maths, you can derive new mathematical theorems from the definition of what is the number 1, what is the number 2, what is the operation of addition. We can prove 1 + 1 = 2 because we defined all those things, and that theorem drops out of our definition. That's as far as
knew that.
Yeah, that's as far as you can get that, because whatever you baked in at the start is what can drop out at the end. You can't get something. So I mean, the best way I can possibly put it, you can't find something out about the real world unless you bake in a premise that has information about the real world in it. Absent information about the world, you can't conclude about the world.
Now, okay, so is that statement, Sam, in your head or is it in the world?
Okay. So it's, technically speaking, it's in my head.
Okay, so then it can't, so it, based on its own criteria, it cannot map to the real world. So we're stuck.
No. Okay, hold on. Okay. So what we're getting into here is why. So what I said just then is, I believe, a consequence of just the way logic works. Now, I contend
in the real world or in your head?
Yeah, logic works in my head, but logic also does apply to the real world. And I have reason to state that.
Okay, does John agree with that? John, do you agree that logic works outside of your head in the real world? Is there a true logical thing outside of humans' heads?
No.
Okay.
I think,
again, what I'm trying to do here is I don't want to move on unless we're all in agreement with something. So again, Sam and John, why don't you discuss that? Because I would tend to agree with Sam that logic exists outside of our heads.
Outside of our heads.
Well, not exists, but that it works outside of our heads.
Can I answer that then? I just said no. That was the start of my answer. No, comma. It's because logic is thought, and the real world doesn't think. You know, the universe is not capable of thought.
Right, and that's what I was about to say, is that when I say the universe is logical, what I'm saying is any true statement about the universe is a logically consistent statement, right?
It's a match.
I'm thinking about the statement I'm making. It's not about the thing itself.
It's a match. That's the only thing it is. It's like the map being a good and accurate representation of the territory. It's not that the universe is doing the logic at all.
But that definition of logic, begs the question. You're saying logic is a thought process. The universe does not think, therefore logic cannot be in. But if that's not how we define logic, if logic is not that which a thinking thing does, then that changes everything.
So I don't think that logic is what a thinking thing does. I think you can think logically. I think logic itself is a framework and a kind of a system of defining relations of one thing to another, if that makes sense. So if you think about, for example, the foundation of logic is the 3 logical absolutes, law of, A is A. A is not A, law of excluded middle. You can't be both yes and you can't be and not be at the same time in the same sense. Those are our foundations of logic. Now,
I've got some comments.
Would you like to run the show?
I'm loving it. I got some comments to make about the law of identity, but it's too much for this show. We could maybe do it another time, because I don't think it's real.
Oh, gee. Okay, well, that is a whole other thing.
Exactly.
I would contend.
Come back another day and we'll do that. Anyway, I wanted to say that what's been going on here in part is particularly Tim. Tim, we all want certainty. I don't know who came up with the expression "ignorance is bliss," but they were idiots because ignorance is doubt. Ignorance is not knowing. Ignorance is going out there and getting stung by that snake because you didn't know that it was a poisonous one. So we all
you found a new species of snake, and that's really interesting. I find that fun. I find ignorance fun because you've got things to think about still. But,
well, yes, indeed. Well, absolutely.
I would say the same thing. I love the process of discovery. I think I've been framed as like this weird Christian science denier, and that I don't like empirical evidence. And Sam can attest that that's not the case at all. Like, I'm not a science denier in that sense. I don't want anyone to come off thinking that like Tim's this weird fundamentalist young Earth creationist that just denies the efficiency of science. That's not the case. I'm not that person.
I didn't mean to imply that it wasn't fun being ignorant and that, it's a driver for discovery. It's scary, though. That's the point. When you don't know something, it's dangerous to go there. So, and I also wanted to say something about logic, because we think of it, it's a thought process. It's the best thought process we've got, but it's polar. We can think of things that are extremes and opposites. Popper didn't think like that. He didn't think that falsifiable versus non-falsifiable was an either or. He thought that it was a good test that may point us in the right direction, because science is built on it deals with the natural realm, and the natural realm is all relative. There's nothing absolute that can be either this or that.
Except for that statement, right?
Although, that statement is in my head. That's not in the natural realm. So
then you can't make a statement about the natural realm if it's only in your head, because you're just in your head.
Oh no, we're getting. Oh, this is getting complex. So, if I may jump back to what I was saying before about why on earth should I believe that my logic about my map maps up to logic about the real world? Okay, why should the inferences on the map lead to inferences about the territory? Look, I mean, I view the three laws of logic as just definitions of what the word "not" means. If I tell you, this is not a cat, okay? If I then backtrack on that and say, actually, it is a cat, and I want you to hold those two statements both true at the same time, you've lost what on earth I mean by the word "not." What did I mean to say by saying this is not a cat if it actually is? Okay, I would have made an incoherent statement. Okay, and I think we can probably all agree that the only true statements out there are statements. Okay, if I haven't made a statement, I can't have possibly made a true statement. So what that means is any statement that I make about the real world that's accurate, any accurate statement I make has to be a statement. And if it's not consistent with logic, then it's not a statement at all. That's good reason to conclude that the real world is logical, in the sense that any true statement I make of the real world has to be logically consistent. It has to follow those laws of logic. And knowing that, I can apply logic to my model and know that if it works in the model and the model matches, it'll match the real world too. That's how you can trust that I'm actually learning something about the world, but it is dependent on me getting the model right.
Frank has got a lot to say here, and we don't want to leave him unaddressed because he's a regular viewer. Frank, you're welcome. Please come again. We'll try and deal with your points here.
I mean, I would take issue with that definition of objective and subjective. That's not how I'm using it, but
yeah, that's a bone of contention. Granted. My view of objective is that it mustn't have gone through a brain, basically, because on the way through, it would have got tainted.
That's another very scientist thing to say. Is that the second you've interacted with something, you've changed it and tainted it.
Yes. So I'm just putting up some of Frank's contributions here. He likes something that you just said. It was a while back now, so I'm not sure whether.
Yeah, we did have a rather long period of 3 people, you know, expressing their opinions.
I think it was mostly you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm generally a pretty outspoken person about what I think about things. It's probably why I participate in these discussions. But I think it's good. I think it's great to have a bit of passion behind you, you know.
Absolutely, it's exactly why I recruited you to this show.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I think Sam, one comment that I would make is it's more of a question, but I think I'm fine answering it and, you know, laying my cards on the table. Now, I think the logic, the thing that which makes something be or not be is not merely inside our head. I don't think logic is merely the process of thinking or something that happens inside of our heads. And so I think that's the difference. And so I would say that while a lot of what you said I agree with, but I think the reason that what is in our heads can be mapped to what's outside of our heads is because there is a connection between what's inside of our heads and outside of our heads. That connection is real and fundamental to reality. That reality cannot be and not be in the same sense. That something cannot be your pen and your cat at the same time. And what I'm saying is, to be really clear, this is where the map territory thing gets all murky. I'm saying that not just merely in my head. It's not just in my head that your pen can't be your cat, but in at the territory level, your pen cannot be your cat. Now, if you can agree with that, right? If you can agree that your pen cannot be your cat, not just in your head, not just in a model that we've made inside our heads, right? If you agree that, you have to ask, why is that the case? Why can your pen not also be your cat in the same way? And if you say, well, it can't be only because I can't think of that.
No, it's not just because it's not a limit in my thinking. What it is, and
right, so it's in the real. So there's something in the real world.
Yeah, in the territory, not just the map.
In the territory, right?
In the territory, a cat. Now,
has a definition.
Someone's going to bring up Schrödinger here, and we'll deal with that when we deal with it. But my cat can't both be my cat and not be my cat in the same sense at the same time. And the reason that statement can't be true is because it's a non-statement, right? So I think you would agree, if I typed a random string of letters in the chat right now, and I asked you, is that statement true? You'd say, well, no, you're not even stating anything. I would contend that's what I'm doing if I say, this is my pen and this is not my pen. I think that's not a coherent utterance.
Yes.
It's not intelligible. And if it's not a coherent utterance, it's not even a statement in the first place. It can't possibly be a true one.
Yes.
Yeah, but we've shifted from territory to statements, and so
this is a statement about the territory. Okay, we're talking about when I'm asking what is true of the territory. Okay, but if I say X is true of the territory, that's a statement I'm making about the territory. Right now, it's okay. So what I'm contending is all true statements about the territory are statements. And if they are statements, they necessarily have to have consistent word usage within them. Okay, they can't take the word not to mean one thing and a completely different thing at the same time. That doesn't make a coherent statement. It's got to be coherent to be true. So any statement I make of the territory has to be a coherent one if it's going to be true. Okay, that's the reason I can trust that matchup.
And again, I don't disagree with any of that, but we keep sliding from the territory and statements about the territory. And I feel like anytime we get to the statement side, that's when you're saying, the statement is in my head.
Let's imagine that let's imagine I have a hypothetical territory where a cat is not a cat. What have I just stated to you about the territory? What idea does that actually convey about it when I'm saying that to you? I don't think that's a meaningful English utterance. I might as well have just said to you the territory is blah, 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 blah. Like it's not a thing that I've said. So how can the territory be blah, blah, blah? It can't. I haven't described anything.
Well done for saying that.
I'm talking about.
Okay, so but the question is, why is that the case?
There is no alternate case. There is no alternate case. If you're saying this is one case where it's coherent and another case where it's... Now, when I say incoherent, I'm not just saying illogical. I'm saying that there isn't a case being described to me that I could say is going on, right? There's like, the world is as the way the world is, okay? That's a tautology. The world is as the world is.
Right.
Now, if I'm saying that it's not the way it is, what do I mean by is? Like, I'm speaking a language here. I've got to convey it with meaningful words. If I don't have meaningful words anymore, then I don't have meaningful statements. There's no framework out there that we could possibly stick together where the world is not consistent, because if we lose consistency, we lose language to talk about it. And if we lose that, then we can't have a discussion in the first place. Like,
Right.
I mean,
I've resorted to putting, that's me, Atheism UK. I've resorted to putting comments up because I can't get in.
yes, we have defined cat to mean something different from pen. Yeah.
But so, John, in light of that, could we define cat and pen as the same thing, and then would they be then the same thing in reality?
Well, I can call my cat pen if I like.
Well, I'd say they would. If you've got the word cat and the word pen, and they have identical definitions, if I look at my territory and find something that matches the definition of one, and they're the same thing, then it's going to match both of them.
Be on here. This is
yes, a cat would then be a pen if you define a pen to be a cat.
So then it's merely dependent on our...
It's not real philosophy. It's just wordplay.
But that's exactly what I've been attempting to avoid this whole entire time.
In order to communicate, we need to agree about meanings, don't we? And cat and pen are different.
But I'm not talking about merely communication. That's why I said we're talking specifically, or I'm asking merely about the territory, not our communication about the territory.
So essentially, your question is, why can't contradictions really exist?
Yes, yes. Why can't contradict? What is the truth-making property in reality that says that a pen and a cat cannot be the same thing at the exact same time? Not in our definitions, not the way we can label them however we want. They could be a shrubber for all I care. But in reality, and if you're saying, well, they could be in reality, we just don't know it. We don't have a model. This pen and my cat could literally be the exact same thing. But I just can't describe it like that. So therefore, I don't have a map in my head that makes that work. That seems really problematic for the notion of truth, capital T, objective truth in the real world and doing any scientific experiment at all. Now, again,
what do you mean by objective truth then? If it's not, my meaning of something that hasn't been tainted through by passing through a brain, what do you mean absolute truth? Because there isn't any of that either.
Is that absolutely true? I mean, again, that doesn't make any sense. You can't make these statements. They don't work.
You can argue that in thought. What is that? There's sophistry is the word for that, isn't it? Because that's all not real. It's all in the map area. It's all not related to the territory.
John, what you just said is exactly the question that I'm asking.
I mean, if we were talking about what truth is, I would have said that a true statement is a statement congruent with reality.
Yes.
So, I mean, to say, all statements about reality are true is kind of just a tautology. Like there's no way around that. That's just what true means.
Sure.
But getting back to, why don't contradictions exist in reality? Same reason. Okay. Statements about reality, like statements congruent with reality, are true statements. If you're saying something is both true and not true, you're saying that it's congruent with reality and not congruent with it. Now, that would imply that reality in some sense is not the way reality is, and that doesn't make that doesn't make sense. You're not making a coherent statement about the nature of reality. Reality is the way it is.
Right, I would agree. You're just restating my position. I completely agree. I'm not.
But no, it's not an assumption. It's by definition of what the word true means. True things are true. Things that are congruent with reality are congruent with reality. That's kind of what we just said. To say
Right.
that they cannot be that at the same time is to go back on my definition of what the word not means.
Right.
Like,
Again,
I'm
you're not
making
disagreeing
a
with me, Sam. So again, I just want to say, I'm like, you said the same thing over and over and over again. You're not disagreeing with me. I'm agreeing. That is a data point that we share, right?
Right.
The question that I'm asking is why? Why is that the case? And if you're saying, well, it's because we can't think of it otherwise.
But it's not. No. It's not just because we don't think of it. It's so
Okay.
This is one of your logically necessary truths that we're so happy to talk about. We've drawn the definitions of the terms, and we're looking down at our Venn diagram of all those definitions laid together, and we're seeing the overlaps. Okay, this is one of these things that we can derive out of the terms that we're using. We've established what the word not means. We've established what the word true means. We've established what territory versus map is talking about. If we lay all of that out on a piece of paper and look at how they overlap, we are left with this statement that, you know, contradictions do not happen in the territory, because contradictions are nonsense statements, and nonsense statements can't be true statements. It drops out of the statements that we already have. It's not a new kernel of information that I'm extracting out of nowhere or assuming. It's within that information that I put into the machine and turn the crank on. It comes back to what we said before, where it's, you know, if you start with a certain bit of information, what deductive logic is really doing is, you could almost say it's just rephrasing what you put into it and popping it out in a new statement that actually doesn't contain new information, but it's stated to you in a way that you're kind of viewing it in a new light, and you say, I've learned something today, right, through my logic. Okay, the argument itself hasn't done that for you. The truth was always there. It's just a matter of how you looked at it, and logic is your lens to kind of look at it in a useful way. That's what we're doing.
We've actually overrun the time that I allocate for this show, and I'm always mindful of the fact that our audience may not have the durability that we do. So I'm prepared to let it run on for a few more minutes, but I'd particularly like us to keep our audience happy by addressing some of their questions. Frank here, he's saying that there does not exist any infallible knowledge of physical reality, and I'm going to plump for agreeing with him here, because I think that our knowledge is provisional, and because we don't know what we're going to discover tomorrow, we can't absolutely, certainly know where anything has been falsified or not.
Well, I mean, are you asking me this question?
Well, I'm just throwing it out there. I'm trying to please address Frank's comment or question.
Go ahead, Sam.
Going, Tim, can you give 3 examples? So I think you're due.
Right. Yeah. I think this question is built on a number of assumptions, ones that I do not share. And so, again, it's a leading question to me, because I understand, or I'm guessing that there's some assumptions there. I didn't claim infallible knowledge of the physical reality, depending on what you mean by that. If you're saying, I think, therefore I exist, is that a physical claim or not? I don't know based on this question, because if someone agrees that humans are reducible to their mere physical parts, well, then that would be infallible in that sense. And I think everyone here on this panel agreed earlier that that would be the case. So that's at least one. Right now, the statements that we're talking about, again, Sam, I'm sorry, but I feel like you started with me nodding in agreement with your last statement, and then you slid into something else a little bit later on in that statement, which again, it just started to cloud it. And I realize that everyone here is nodding in agreement with Sam. Yes, why would the stupid Christian just get this? But I don't think a lot of what you're saying I'm disagreeing with, right? I'm not disagreeing with that. No. Again, I don't think I'm disagreeing with a lot of what you say, but you started by talking about this idea that the territory is logical, and so but then you got to this point where like it wouldn't make any sense to us in our heads and the statements that we use because we're making truth statements. But then we said in the beginning that science is largely instrumental and isn't really dealing with objective truths. And so I'm wondering how those things all fit together in your guys' head. Again, I'm just trying to ask some questions here, and I don't feel like I'm getting lots of answers because every time I ask questions, it starts to slide into another place, and I'm like, I already agree with that. That's not the question that I'm asking. And so if you're saying that we can't make statements, merely illogical statements, because it doesn't comport with reality, you're making a statement about the territory, but then you're saying that that's not objectively true because it's merely instrumental and useful for what we're doing.
No, it is. It is. So
okay, so if it's true, how did you get to that truth? So okay, so if you're saying it is, the question that has been asked several times is how did you get to that truth about the territory? Because then that method is the method that we would then apply to other truth statements apart from merely scientific methodology, or that would be.
Let's take a step back. I think it's worth talking about this point about can we get to anything objectively true? I think we can, but there are things like logical or mathematical theorems which we then go and apply to something else, and the truth of the things we yield from that is dependent on what premises we begin with. So perhaps to kind of appeal to the people who love logic, either here or in the audience, science is perfectly fine with beginning with what it believes to be a true statement and logically inferring something new. Not even necessarily with an experiment. So Einstein, possibly one of the most famous scientists out there, is famous for what he called thought experiments. Now, if you show that to a philosopher, he's going to go, he's just using logical deduction based on some premises he's beginning with. If you talk to a theoretical physicist, they're going to tell you about string theory. You start with the foundation of if the universe was made of strings, and you logically derive everything from there. I have absolutely no problem with that. And provided your starting premise is true, you are going to derive a true conclusion. Now, does that mean that we never test Einstein's special relativity? Of course we still test it. Exactly. And the reason we still test it is because we're uncertain of the premise. It's not because we're uncertain of the argument. We're uncertain of the premise because that premise has been derived from other experiments that came from empirical data, and empirical data always have sources of error in it.
Yep.
For that reason, I would claim that all logical outcomes, they shouldn't be called conclusions, they should be called inferences, need to be tested for a match against observations in the natural realm.
Unless you know for certain your premise that you started with was true, because it's something like a definition, which is how we get things like mathematical theorems, right?
Those are the only
this difference between science and math.
Yes, their deduction is the only syllogism that begins with true premises because we bloody defined them. We've made them up ourselves.
Yeah, and this is the thing, like, I mean, we draw these definitions and derive things about those definitions in hopes that there are really things in the territory out there that actually fall within those definitions that we've drawn.
Yes.
Now, we believe that there are through our observation that we think we trust, right? Now, this gets into, can you trust your senses and your observations and all of that. But
John doesn't believe anything. Just remember that. John doesn't believe stuff.
No, I do. That's a mischaracterization. I do believe things. I believe that coffee tastes nicer without sugar.
But that's clearly not what Sam was talking about, though.
Guys,
look, I mean, I came into this discussion very early on saying that after watching your discussion between the two of you last time, I think I sided with either of you probably in equal measure, but neither of you completely. So that's why I anticipated today was probably going to be quite interesting, is because I think I'm in between the two of you on a couple of things. But nevertheless, look, I think it's a good discussion. I'm seeing a question on the screen. How do we get to objective knowledge? I think I kind of said before, look, we think we can have it, but everything that we get to is either it comes from these definitions, so it's just a logically necessarily something, that it applies to something out there, or we've based it on data that we've collected. There's always uncertainty in our data, and so that's our problem now. So either we've got this problem of, I've derived something necessarily true, let's hope something fits these definitions I'm talking about, or I've got some data and let's hope that my logic follows. Like, my logic follows, yes, but let's hope I can trust that data. There's always that point where you've got to actually trust that your starting point that you're actually, coming from in the first place, there's a bit of trust in there. I mean, it's probably justified trust. And for me, it's justified by the fact that the conclusions I draw actually work for me later on, which is where this pragmatism thing comes from.
This is why
it's almost an inductive argument for it.
This is why science is justified posterior. Well, what am I trying to say? A posteriori. That's it. A posteriori rather than a priori.
Yeah.
Anyway, guys, you've been fantastic. I'm going to wrap up now. We can do this again because it's enjoyable. But maybe, I mean, I don't know. I'll put something in Messenger to both of you and suggest a slightly different topic. It'll probably all regress down to the same area, the way these things do.
It might well, but yes, I think it's still fun if it does.
But we'll talk about doing it again because it's fun. Yeah. So, would you like to have a final word, each of you?
No, I'm good. This is a great conversation. I love it.
Good.
Yeah, I had a good time. And look, I mean, if I want to finish off, I mean, I just want to kind of finish off like, I mean, Tim's been kind of afraid that we're characterizing him as this horrible anti-science person, and like, we're absolutely not. I just want to emphasize that, look, for goodness sake, atheists out there, Christians are reasonable people and they're smart people. And it's just, I think a lot of the time we agree on 99% of things, but there's some of these little kernels down right at the very foundation. And I think we kind of got to one today where we just kind of reached an impasse where we're going, actually, no, I'm not with you there. Yes. And it all kind of follows on from there, but we can still have these kind of reasonable, fun discussions, and I think everyone can get something out of it. I think it's good fun.
Anyway, it's lunchtime here, and the baby's nearly cooked, so I've got to break off now to eat it. So
don't blame me.
Thank you very much, you two guys. You've both been fantastic. Thank you very much, our small audience. The cream has floated to the top again, but we'll have more in the subsequent podcast version when it stops being live streamed. I can't tell you who's coming next week to the show, but I've got some interesting prospects, and I will put them into various Facebook groups and tweets and so on, so that you can all find out what is forthcoming. I'd like everybody to do the usual things. I'm very bad at this, but it's like, it's subscribe, it's set the notifications, and it's comment, and if you want to come on the show, suggest yourself. We are human. Thanks, guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, John. Great being with you.